Hello again. I was almost wondering if I was able to sneak up here and see if anyone knew I was up here. Hey, so if you are new here or haven't been here a while, we are doing something really unique with this series. We're doing some unique elements, trying some new things just for this series, okay? So if you're like, I don't like this at all the things we're doing, don't worry, just come back in February. We'll be back to our normal routine of different things. But we're doing a number of different things that are related to the book that we're studying right now, which is Lamentations. And Lamentations is not something that you can just open up like the book of Romans and go verse by verse and break it down line by line. This is something that was written in a very dark place in someone's life, and the people of God, and when they were in a very dark place, and they're trying to process these emotions. And so Lamentations is more about something that you experience and that you step into, that you feel. And that's what we've been trying to structure everything around with this series when we're talking about grief. Now, I need to stress, I am not a licensed therapist or counselor. So in this talk, even today, as we're going to be talking about grief and we're going to be talking about the anger and frustration related to grief, if you're not comfortable hearing this, you are more than welcome to even get up and leave the room, come back in February when we're back to our next series where we're going to be walking through the book of Genesis, right? And that's perfectly fine if that's something that you need to do today, especially with the topic we're talking about today. But I'm hopeful that today's talk is going to be very encouraging and very liberating and comforting. And we're going to begin this by a corporate act of prayer. We've been doing this the past 2 weeks, so you guys, if you've been here, you're familiar with this. Hopefully you're not exhausted by this. But the beauty of this is it invites us to actually pray for one another. Not that silly stuff where you're like, hey, I'm going to pray for you, but you never do, right? Or when we only pray, we only say the bad things that are going on in our lives. So we're going to start off with the prayer of thanksgiving, because if we're going to be talking about grief the rest of the morning, let's have hearts that are full of first thanksgiving for all that God has given us. And as Christians, as followers of Jesus, if you're like, I don't have a single thing to be thankful for right now, I don't know if you're following Jesus, my friends. Now, that doesn't mean every single one of you needs to come up to a microphone and say something right now, but it should naturally be in our heart that we have something that we are thankful for right now. And we're going to share in that together, because that's what this faith journey is all about. It's not you in Jesus. It's always an us in Jesus thing. It's a corporate thing where we are part of a community that's bringing all things back to Jesus, and that includes the things that we are thankful for. And so thank you so much, Cindy, for already throwing it up on the screen, the prompt. And so here's how this is going to work if you're new here or don't know how this works. And those of you who are watching online, feel free to be part of this as well. What this is going to involve is there's a microphone in the back of the room upstairs. For those of you in the balcony, there's one up here. And there's no rush on this, but if there's something that you want to express thanksgiving for, whether it's something going on in your life or it's flamingos, and right? And that happened one year. Ethan, I think, did that a few years ago. And that's wonderful, my friends. That actually is really wonderful. So if there's something that you just want to express some thanksgiving for, I want to encourage you to come up to the microphone. Don't give a long backstory. This is one sentence, right? Where you say, for blank, loving God. And then when you say loving God, that tells the rest of the body to join in with what you're thankful for by saying, we give you thanks, right? This is a wonderful way of actually truly praying for one another rather than just saying, yeah, I'll pray for you. But this is a way that we step into the joy of one another. And that's a wonderful grace that God has given us, my friends, that we can do that. So I'm going to start us off. I'll say the first one. Feel free to come up to one of the mics. And it's okay if there's a little bit of silence and awkwardness. I know we're Americans. We don't like silence. But you read Scripture, and God oftentimes speaks in the silence. And we need to be better at that. All right? So let me go ahead and start us off with the first one. For getting us all here safely, loving God. And give you thanks.
For freeing some of the hostages this morning. Amen.
We give you thanks.
For mercy, grace, and the gift of salvation, loving God.
We give you thanks.
For hot water, Jesus. Thank you so much. Loving God.
We give you thanks. for the shelter you give us, loving God. Thanks.
For healing both physically and spiritually, loving God.
We give you thanks.
For our grandbaby having her surgery this week and getting through it so well, loving God.
We give you thanks.
For all of life lessons and what we've learned, loving God.
We give you thanks. For this church body, loving God. Thanks. We give you thanks.
For true friends and family, loving God.
We give you thanks. For the ways you're always with us, loving God. We give you thanks. We give you thanks.
For a God who truly listens to us.
We give you thanks. Would you join me now in a word of prayer? Jesus, thank you for this day. But thank you even more for your salvation, your grace, and your mercy. I'm praying now as we turn our attention now to Lamentations chapter 3, and we wrestle with the difficult emotions and feelings and words that are written on this page. May we approach them with sacred awe, and may we hear what you have to say to our hearts to help mend those who are hurting today. It's in your name we pray. Amen. One of the aspects I've noticed in counseling people when they're going through grief and trial is that there's oftentimes anger and frustration related to it. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that anger is because you're in a situation and you know you did nothing to deserve it. You did everything right. You said the right things. You did the right things. You were at the right places. And yet the disaster still happened. You were the faithful one, but your spouse had the affair. You were the loyal one, but someone else cheated. Someone else stole. Someone else did the crime, but you're left picking up the pieces and doing the time. And in that space, there can be a lot of anger. And there can be a lot of frustration. Because you know you're the victim. And it was done, whatever was done by someone who was close to you, someone you thought you can count on. I've seen this happen many times, and you start to naturally blame others. You're like, okay, this person did this thing, or this person did that thing, but sometimes our blame goes much further than that. Sometimes we end up looking at God and think, God, I did everything right. I was going to church. I was reading my Bible every day. I was talking to you about other people. I was praying a lot. I was doing all the right things, God. Why did this thing happen over here? You let me down, God. And if you feel that way, first off, that's perfectly all right. Because believe it or not, the Bible actually gives us voice to process those feelings and emotions. Because sometimes we may go through a situation like that, where you know you're completely innocent. And you know it's the other person who did the crime, but you're serving the time. We've all experienced that, and if you haven't, you probably will one day. And if that moment brings you to a point where you're asking, God, where are you in this? Or God, why did you allow this to happen? Or God, I don't understand. You say that you're going to watch over us, but you allowed this thing to happen? I was faithful. I was doing the right thing, God. The chapter we're going to be looking at today gives us space to process that dark pit of grief. And so today we're going to hear a reading over chapter 3. Now, chapter 3 is the long one in the book of Lamentations. Now, some of you are already looking ahead and you're like, there's a lot of verses in chapter 3. All right? So today we're going to have two individuals who are going to come up and do readings at the beginning and the end of this message. But the one who's doing the beginning is going to be Jeannie Ledarsic. I've asked her only to read the first half. You guys are welcome. And then Brent will do the last half with a little bit of overlap on the verses. But as she's coming up, I just want to encourage you guys to maybe take some deep breaths, maybe to listen carefully. Pay very close attention to the words in this one, because this is the big one out of all of the 5 chapters of Lamentations, of the emotions it deals with. The language is raw and ugly, but you find in that a grace of God at the end. And so I want you to really pay attention and try to experience this now, because this is something sacred. So Jeannie, if you would, please.
I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand, again and again the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with blocks of stones. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. I have become the laughingstock of all peoples, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has saddened me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereaved of peace. I have begotten what happiness is. So I say my endurance has perished. So has my hope from Yahweh. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and all the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of Yahweh never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Yahweh is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. Yahweh is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of Yahweh. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke of his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth to the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one that strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever. But though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men.
The word of the Lord. Praise be to God. Did you catch the different tone in this one? compared to the past few weeks. And what I mean is the pronouns being used. You see, in the previous 2 chapters that we've looked at, the pronouns have been, we've done this bad thing, or they did this bad thing, but this is different. The pronouns in this one are incredibly personal that Jeremiah is writing. Let me go ahead and read them off to you again. So verse 1 of chapter 3, he says, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He's talking about the way that he feels God has treated him. He says, he has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. Do you hear the personal tones? This is Jeremiah, a prophet of God, who's writing, and his perspective is perfectly valid with everything he's gone through. He has given his life to God. He has preached the message that God has told him to preach, and his reward was not success. It was not happiness. It was not prosperity. It was not an easy life, but the reward he got for the message that God told him to deliver was he was mocked, he was beaten, he was abandoned, he was insulted, he was tortured, and then eventually he watched his people fall into desolation and destruction. And he ends his career in failure. He was a man who knew of God's light, and he knew that God had called him to step into the darkness to proclaim that light, and yet the way that Jeremiah feels he is being treated and he's experiencing right now is that for all of his effort to do what God had told him to do, left him nowhere but further into darkness. And so he's angry. And he's voicing to God that this doesn't seem right, that this doesn't seem good, that this is not what he wants at all. Now, you may have a hard time swallowing the pill of someone blaming God. But this is in the Bible. And so, first off, I get that this is uncomfortable. I come from a faith tradition that was like, you never question the sermon, you never question your faith or anything like that. But this is in the Bible. And that should tell us that God permits us to be in this difficult space where sometimes we have this faith tradition that says God will always take care of us, but we're in a reality where the perception right now is like, well, I'm struggling to see where the two of these meet. And yet this is in the Bible, where God is inviting us to wrestle with this tension, where he's showing that he's big enough and emotionally secure enough that if we need to express our anger and frustration, if we need to point the finger, we can, even at God. That he's big enough to still be there, to love us through that, to work with that through us in this moment. And so that's what Jeremiah's experienced. He's like, God, I'm upset. And maybe some of you feel the same way. Maybe you come in and right now, church is hard. And I get that. And I've been there. And I know what that's like. And so please hear me right now. If you're here and you feel like, gosh, faith and church is hard, or you're going through something that is incredibly hard right now, where you're having a hard time believing that God cares, that God is good, that God is gracious, that God is with you right this, please hear me on this right now. It is okay to be wrestling with all of that darkness and still come to church looking for hope and salvation. You're not going to be turned away if you come in and you're like, I'm here today and I'm not fine and this is hard and I'm still here. You're not going to be turned away from that. And I say that because I have seen far too many give up on church and walk away because they're in a hardship and they do not feel like they have the freedom to voice saying, I'm struggling right now, or I don't even have faith right now. I have seen many people over the past few years who come to church who are like, I lost my faith a long time ago, but I still come here because I'm looking for it again. And some of them have found it again. And they've recovered that joy of their salvation. But they had to walk through that ugliness of the anger and the grief and the frustration. And so if that is you, let me tell you, you are not going to be turned away here. If you need to process such emotions, and I say that as one who has been through that journey myself. And I know what's it like when you're so angry and the only thing you can think of is thinking, God, I've done everything right. I know I've done everything right. I know I've done what you've told me to do, and this is what I'm getting in my reward. I know what that feels like. And Jeremiah knows what that feels like. And God gives us space to process that emotion and work with him on that. But here's what's beautiful, and this is important. As Jeremiah is expressing his perspective on his situation, which first off, we all have our perspective on our situation, and we should be humble and honest to admit that maybe sometimes our perspective is not the full story. He's humble enough to admit the same thing. Because as he expresses his perspective on his situation, he then turns around and does not remain there, but preaches truth back to himself. So you see that in verse 20. In verse 20, he starts off, he says, my soul, which remember, if we've been following along with us for the past few years, every time we've talked about soul, it doesn't mean some little ghosts inside of you. It means the entirety of who you are. So he says, my soul, the entirety of who I am, continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. He's like, every little part of me remembers what has happened. Every little part of me feels the ache of this burden, feels the anger, feels the frustration, feels the pain from what I've gone through. Every little part of me feels it. He's like, that's my perspective. That's what I'm going through. That's why I see his reality right now. But then verse 21, he says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. This is action words. He's like, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I'm seeing, but I'm going to teach myself and proclaim what truth is in this moment, because while my feelings aren't fully there, I still know logically what is the truth, and I'm going to say it until my feelings are aligned with what I know is true. And here's the truth that he shares in verse 22. The steadfast love of Yahweh never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Yahweh is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will have hope in him. See, Jeremiah knew that the God he worshiped was big enough to handle all of his ugly emotions. But he knew that his emotions were not the full reality that he was experiencing. He knew that as a finite creature, he could only perceive so much. He could not perceive the full scope of eternity of what was going on in the mind of an infinite God. But what he did know was that this God kept his promises. This God kept his word. And so when this God spoke saying, I love you and I'm going to be faithful to you and I'm going to take care of you, even when that taking care might not look presently like how we want it to look like, Jeremiah had the trust that God was going to get him through his own dark and ugly emotions. That God was going to lead him through this situation, even the situation in the moment that he was like, God, I'm angry at you for what I'm going through, but I know you're going to lead me through this. And that teaches us some very important thing, that our perspective is always welcome before God, but our perspective is not always fully true of what reality is. And in this, as we see how Jeremiah dealt with his feelings of personal offense and how he dealt with his situation and where it eventually leads him to, which is where we're going to read in just a moment, it teaches us a very valuable tool that we can have right now in our own grief. And it's that altering our perspective can place us at the altar of God's healing. Our perspective, our emotions are always welcome before God. But when we turn around and we give God everything that we have in the moment, saying, God, this is what I'm bringing into this moment right now before you, that oftentimes frees us up to say, okay, now please help me take your truth. Help me to take your word into this situation. Help me to take what you have to say back into this moment so that my perspective is not the full story and my perspective does not lead me down a path of desolation. Altering our perspective, which is about preaching truth to ourselves in the midst of our anger and grief, can place us at the altar of God's healing. And that's what Jeremiah starts to feel, and that's what he starts to experience, his own healing. And we're going to see that in the second part of this reading. So, Brent, if you wouldn't mind coming up, I want to encourage you guys once again to settle yourselves to hear God's sacred word. Brent's going to be picking up in verse 20, and he's going to be reading through the rest of the chapter. So there's going to be a little overlap on some of the things that were said. But the last half of this chapter is all about Jeremiah taking steps towards healing. step by step, as he is preaching truth to himself, as he is working his way through these ugly emotions into what wonderful joy God has for him on the other side of this healing. And so, Brent, if you wouldn't mind reading for us now.
Verse 20. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of Yahweh never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Yahweh is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. Yahweh is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of Yahweh. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid upon him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever. But though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men. To crush underfoot all the prisoners of the earth, to deny a man justice in the presence of the Most High. To subvert a man in his lawsuit, the Lord does not approve. Who has spoken it, and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should a living man complain, a man, about the punishment of his sins? Let us test and examine our ways and return to Yahweh. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to the God of heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have wrapped yourself with anger and pursued us, killing without pity. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can pass through. You have made us scum and garbage among the peoples. All your enemies open their mouths against us. Panic and pitfall have come upon us, devastation and destruction. My eyes flow with rivers of tears because of the destructions of the daughters of my people. My eyes will flow without ceasing, without respite, until Yahweh from heaven looks down and sees. My eyes cause me grief at the fate of all the daughters of my city. I have been hunted like a bird by those who were my enemies without cause. They flung me alive into the pit and cast stones upon me. Water closed in over my head. I said, I am lost. I called to your name, O Yahweh, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help. You came to me when I called to you. You said, do not fear. You have taken up my cause, O Lord. You have redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Yahweh. Judge my cause. You have seen all their vengeance, all their plots against me. You have heard the taunts, O Yahweh, all their plots against me. The lips and thoughts of my assailants are against me all day long. Behold, their sitting and their rising. I am the subject of their taunts. You will repay them, O Yahweh, according to the work of their hands. You will give them dullness of heart. Your curse will be on them. You will pursue them in anger and destroy them from under your heavens, O Yahweh. The word of the Lord.
A new perspective can oftentimes lead to new actions. And you take that course long enough, and eventually new behaviors and new character comes to the surface. And we see that in Jeremiah. He says something very particular in chapter 3 of Lamentations, where in chapter 3, verse 25, he says, Yahweh is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of Yahweh. Now, I'm going to say something challenging, and you're more than welcome to disagree with me, and we'll still love Jesus and all that, all right? But when I think and meditate over, man, what does the church world need today in the 21st century? It's not a bigger push of more programs and dynamic leaders. It's not a bigger push for leadership. And the great cry and necessity is not even evangelism, which is important. But the great urgency needed to be seen in followers of Jesus right now is people who know how to be patient and wait on the Lord. And that's challenging to us. We don't like that. We don't like to wait. We are an age of speed. Anything you want, you can get by the push of a button and things like that, and it'll be delivered to your door. So the idea of waiting on God to act in your situation, it's incredibly uncomfortable. And yet you follow the biblical authors, and this is what they say over and over and over again, more than anything else that is needed of followers of Jesus now, is to be people who wait patiently on the Lord. And so that's what Jeremiah is doing. He's in a situation where he knows he is powerless. And as he is altering his perspective and coming before God, he's having to be patient that this journey of healing is not going to be an overnight thing. That God works very slowly to build beautiful things. And so he's having to learn to be patient, because it is in our patience that we surrender our control and surrender our desires and to surrender our pride and surrender our addictions in humble anticipation that God will exalt his people and will set things right when the timing is right. That God will build something beautiful if we were just to be patient and allow him to work in his timing. And I know that's not comfortable to hear. I do not like that. I wish God worked like the fast food chains and the Amazon things that we buy nowadays, where the push a button, you get what you want. But that's not how God works. And he's good at taking care of people. And so if he goes slow and working us through the journey of healing through our grief, it's because it is what is good for us. And in that space, what we are called to do is to look internal, to wrestle with a few things. And Jeremiah does that. He encourages us to do it as well in verse 40, where he says, let us test and examine our ways and return to Yahweh. This is a call to start turning internal. That in our waiting, what we're doing is we're looking at seeing what were the lies and what were the faulty perspectives that we've been living in right now that we need to bring back to God, that we need to bring to Jesus and say, Jesus, would you work with this? Would you do something with this? And it's oftentimes in that space we find ourselves at the rock bottom. The very spaces where we oftentimes think God has abandoned us, or God has given up on us, or God has brought us there to hurt us, or God doesn't care for us. And yet in that space that Jeremiah was in, it was exactly there we found God. And you see that in verse 55, where he says, I called on your name, O Yahweh, from the depths of the pit. He's like, I've hit rock bottom, and I finally was like, God, I need you in this moment, because I can't do anything, and everything I've done has led me to this point right here, and I need you. So that's what he's saying. He says, you heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help. You came near when I called on you, and you said, do not fear. Isn't that wonderful to be able to hear something like that when you're at rock bottom? For God to be near and say, don't fear. I've got this. I'm working on this. Like that would bring the joy of the next verse. Where it says, you have taken up my cause, O Yahweh. You have redeemed my life. What a joy to be able to say that when we've hit rock bottom. You see, in this journey that we've seen in chapter 3, our perspective is always welcome, even when our perspective is ugly and messy and not very religious. God still welcomes it. He gives us that space. He's emotionally mature enough to handle it. But here's the important thing. In the expressing of our perspective, we follow it up with preaching truth to ourselves And that truth will oftentimes help us to be able to see what Jeremiah saw, that in our rock bottom, in the moment, the thing that had us so angry, that had us thinking God had abandoned us, we stop looking up and we start looking side to side and we realize Jesus is right there with us in this. That he has chosen to be in that with us. He has heard our cries in that moment, and it has broken his heart too. And he whispers to us how good he is and that he is doing something. He is working in this moment. And while we might wrestle in the meantime, still in the pit, we take great confidence that God will set things right. And I think that's partly why on the night before he died, what Jesus left his followers was a meal. And he asked them when they gather together to take part in this meal. A meal that he said represented his body being broken to pieces and his blood being poured out. And I think he did that because there are going to be times in our own life where we feel like we've broken to pieces, where we feel drained and poured out. And I think he gave us this so that we would remember, while we might not have chosen that for ourselves, he chose it as the means by which bringing a salvation upon all of us and knowing that resurrection was coming. And so while we might still be sitting in our own moments of crucifixion, we can take part in recognizing God made this moment sanctified in Jesus when he allowed himself to be broken. And then he brought the resurrection a few days later. And we wait for God to act in our situation as well. And so this morning we're going to take part in communion again. And maybe you come into this room and you've got your own quiet, unexpressed anger and frustration over some grief or situations you're going through. Maybe you've been there where you've even blamed God before. And I want you to take this recognizing the love that God has for you. His willingness to be broken for you. And so maybe as you take this, you need to do something before you do that. Maybe you just need to unburden yourself. Maybe you need to just lay something down and give it to God. Maybe you need to even write on a card and say, God, I am angry with you at the moment. And then you need to give it to Jesus before you take communion. And so that's why we have those index cards. This is not something you all have to do. But if you feel like in this moment, before taking communion, you need to just unburden yourself. You need to just give something to Jesus. We encourage you, take that note, write on it, fold it up in a tiny little wad. No one's going to read it, but fold it up and then toss it right there at the foot of the cross before you take communion. That way you have that freedom to say, you know what? I gave this to God even when it was ugly. I gave it to him. Because even the ugliness, he's much better at taking care of than I am. And so I'm giving this ugliness to him. So in this moment, I can take what grace and mercy and love he has, and I can preach a better message to myself. And so that's what the opportunity, the gift that we're trying to give to you this morning with the little index card, if you need to do that. But before we even get to that portion, all right, that's going to be when the band comes up and you're ready, you need to come up, do communion, then you can. But before we do that, we're going to close off with another corporate prayer exercise. And this one is about petition. This one is about saying, God, here's where I'm asking you to please work in my life or in the world around me. And so thank you, Cindy, for throwing that up on the screen. It's going to work the exact same way as the one we did at the beginning of our service. And once again, there's no judgment on this. Please don't give a long backstory. This is just a single sentence. But the beauty of this is it frees us to see one another. Because so oftentimes in our burdens and in our pains and the things that we're carrying, we feel like we're carrying it alone. And we feel like no one's there for us. But this moment is full of grace. Because as you express something, asking for the mercy of God to work in this moment, in the situation that's on your heart and on your mind, you get to hear a body say, this is our prayer too. A body of others who are saying, you're not alone, but you are loved and you are going through this journey with others. That's the beauty of this. This is where real prayer happens. Not, oh yeah, I'll pray for you in a text message. But when you can look at the people in the eye and say, they have just voiced that they're praying, that they are in this moment with me, that's something beautiful. And so let me start it off, and if you've got something, once again, for those of you watching online, feel free to write something. There's a microphone up there. For those of you up on the balcony, there's one right here. We're going to do it the exact same way. Let me start us off, and once again, if there's silence, that's perfectly fine. Let God speak to your heart in silence. But if you got something that you want to express and ask for the mercy of God for, please share it in a microphone so that we can all share it together. So let me start us off. For Henry Osborne, merciful God. Hear our prayer. For those who have lost their homes in the wildfires, merciful God. Hear our prayer. For those carrying anger and frustration and bitterness, merciful God. Hear our prayer.
For healing family and friends in all situations, merciful God.
Hear our prayer.
For those of us who have lived with PTSD, merciful God.
Hear our prayer. For those who feel like they're the victims suffering injustice, merciful God. Hear our prayer. For those of us who feel lonely, merciful God. Hear our prayer. For those of us with broken families, merciful God. Hear our prayer. Hear our prayer.
For family members and friends who do not know the Lord, merciful God.
Hear our prayer.
For long suffering without grumbling, merciful God.
Hear our prayer.
For those who need forgiveness, who need to learn how to forgive, merciful God.
Hear our prayer. For those with secret sins that they have a lot of fear that they can't confess. Merciful God, hear our prayer. For those who feel guilty because they've made mistakes that have hurt others, merciful God, hear our prayer. Would you pray with me now? Jesus, you are good. But sometimes we go through situations that are not good, and oh gosh, it is so easy to turn the finger and point at you and say that you're not faithful or you're not good. Forgive us for that. Show us a better reality. Help us to preach truth to ourselves, because we are so finite and our perspective is so limited oftentimes. But you see the big picture and you tell us how much you love us and how much you care for us and how much you're still there for us, even when we've done everything possible to give you an excuse to walk away. And so right now, as we sing, Father, may our hearts be lifted with joy, knowing that you are so patient with us and working something good in us, even in the midst of our hardships. And if there are those in this room who do not know you, or they're just playing a game, they don't have a relationship with you, I'm praying that they might start to see you in a fresh new light. That their hearts might ache with the reality that they need you, that they can't keep doing this themselves. Father, I'm praying that you would bring quite a restoration to our weary hearts. Remind us how good of a Savior you are. And please do a work in us. It is in your name I pray. Amen.